More Podcast Day 24 speakers. Fortunately, the latest from our daily newsletter at podnews.net. After announcing a move to Times Radio earlier this week, podcast and radio presenters Jane Garvey and Fee Glover have been confirmed as speakers for next Tuesday's Podcast Day 24 in London. Podcast Day 24 in Sydney will also include Spotify's new signings Tony and Ryan and Waleed Ali. Tickets to each event include catch-up from the other side of the planet. Podnews has a special coupon to get you around half price. It's POD-N 1215. Those purchased podcast plays are all okay, it seems. After yesterday's news that iHeartMedia and others have been purchasing podcast plays in game apps, Podtrac tells us, we decided not to filter these downloads as they are consistent with the latest IAB guidelines. It's our understanding they appear as browser traffic without a unique user agent or unique IP address. These downloads don't have a material impact on the publisher rankings, including the rank order of the top publishers. Acast has published research on podcast listening in Asia, looking at Hong Kong, Singapore and Japan. 90% of listeners in those countries finish all or most of a podcast episode. 70% say they're most focused when consuming podcasts rather than consuming other media. Listening to podcasts in Canada continues to increase. Signal Hill Insights and TPX have published data from the Canadian podcast listener showing a 17% increase in monthly listeners. We reported on Monday that Spotify's podcast analytics were missing data. The company has placed a banner on Spotify for podcasters saying the issue will be fixed as soon as possible. It looks like recent days are back to normal though. The Ramsey network appears to have switched from Libsyn to Megaphone. A few months ago, flagship The Ramsey Show reached 1 billion downloads in March 2021. Yesterday, Serial was number one in Spotify podcasts for both the US and Canada, deposing Joe Rogan, who's normally there. In our newsletter today, you can find out if Serial is still number one in Spotify. You'll find that at podnews.net. Former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo is to host his own podcast. His brother, former CNN anchor Chris Cuomo, has been publishing his podcast twice weekly. And in People News, Michael Holt is one of 3 senior leadership hires at VoiceWorks Sport as Director of Commercial Partnerships. He has more than 20 years' experience in audio and TV. I worked with him about 20 years ago. The company also welcomed Stefan Doyle as Head of Sports Social and Richard Herrick as Sport Partnerships Director. And in podcast news, financial advice podcast Afford Anything has signed with a Cumulus podcast network hosted by Paula Pant. The show has more than 22 million downloads. And the CIA has launched its own podcast, The Langley Files, a CIA podcast. Released its first episode last week with predictable, humorous results from the internet. We notice it's hosted by Transistor, a podcast hosting company based in Canada. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.